Some killers act out of greed, some out of madness, and some because the world left them no other choice. Tonight, we bring you 4 stories that should never have happened. 4 lives,
By the time
4
the fire
crimes,
department arrived,
4 moments where the systems meant to protect people failed completely. These are not just murder cases. They are stories of silence instead of help, power instead of protection, greed instead of conscience, fear instead of justice. One woman killed her children in the grip of untreated mental illness. One woman hunted her husbands for profit.
By the time
one
the fire
group of young
department
people
arrived, the
burned a
house was
man's
already
body to
lost.
erase their crime.
But just
And one abused wife crossed a line the law will never forgive after the law abandoned her first. Different places, different motives, different faces of evil, but one shared truth. Every one of these tragedies could have been stopped. Tonight, we're not just telling you what happened. We're asking why it was allowed to happen. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't the killer. It's the system that looked the other way. This is not just true crime. This is system failure. This is human collapse. This is justice undone. And these are the 4 cases that prove it. Good evening. What happened in Aiea, Hawaii in 1965 was not just a crime. It was a warning that went unheard. A young mother begged for help, doctors sent her home, and days later an entire family was dead. This is the story of a tragedy that could have been stopped. A story that, even now nearly 6 decades later, sends chills through those who remember. A story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about mental illness, about the systems meant to protect us, and about the thin line between normalcy and tragedy. Tonight, we revisit one of Hawaii's most devastating cases, one of the worst multiple homicides in the state's history, and perhaps most tragically, the largest familicide ever recorded in these islands. This is not an easy story to tell, but it is a necessary one, because what happened on November 22, 1965, in the quiet town of Aiea, wasn't just a crime. It was a failure of recognition, a failure of treatment, a failure to understand the deadly, serious nature of postpartum depression and its potential to spiral into psychosis. Let me take you back. November 1965. Hawaii had been a state for just 6 years. The Vietnam War was escalating. American military families were stationed throughout the islands. Aiea was a peaceful community, home to military personnel and their families, tree-lined streets, children playing, the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone. On Nalapaka Place, there lived a family. Captain James Young, an Air Force pilot stationed at Hickam Air Force Base, lived there with his wife Maggie and their children. James was 36 years old, a dedicated military man, often away on flying missions. Maggie was 38. A mother of 7 children in total, though 2 daughters from a previous marriage had grown up, married, and moved into their own homes. That left 5 children still in the home, 5 young lives, 5 innocent souls. Jessica, just 8 months old, barely beginning to explore the world. Jeanette, 2 years old, learning to speak, to run, to laugh. Judith, 3 years old, full of curiosity and wonder. Janice, 5 years old, probably excited about starting school soon, and James Frank Jr., 8 years old, already attending Alva Scott Elementary School, a bright boy with his whole life ahead of him. But something was wrong in that house. Something had been wrong for months. And on that November morning, everything that had been building beneath the surface would erupt in the most horrific way imaginable. November 22nd, 1965, began like any other Monday morning. Captain James Young had left for a flying mission. He kissed his family goodbye, not knowing it would be the last time he would see his children alive. His 8-year-old son, James Jr., got ready for school. The morning routine, breakfast, getting dressed, the normal sounds of a household with young children. At approximately 8 a.m., young James headed off to school. Alva Scott Elementary was within walking distance. It should have been a safe, normal day of learning and playing with friends. But back at the house on Nalapaka Place, something terrible was beginning. Shortly after James Jr. left for school, Maggie Young made a decision born from a mind that was no longer functioning in reality, a mind consumed by delusions, by a diseased and deranged condition that would later be identified as paranoid schizophrenia, likely triggered or exacerbated by severe postpartum depression. She took her oldest daughter, Janice, 5 years old, into the bathroom. She filled the bathtub, and she drowned her own child, held her under the water until there was no life left. Then she went and got Judith, age 3. The same bathroom, the same bathtub, the same unthinkable act. Then Jeanette, just 2 years old. Then Jessica, a baby, 8 months old, an infant who had barely begun to experience life. 4 little girls, 4 daughters, all drowned, one by one, in the family bathtub, methodically, systematically. But Maggie Young wasn't finished. At 9:30 in the morning, Maggie Young walked out of her house. She walked to Alva Scott Elementary School. She went to her son's classroom and told school officials she needed to take James Jr. home. Perhaps there was a family emergency, they might have thought. Perhaps a doctor's appointment. The school had no reason to refuse a mother taking her own child. James Jr. walked home with his mother, holding her hand, trusting her completely as any 8-year-old child would trust his mother. He walked into his house. He didn't know that his 4 sisters lay dead just rooms away. He didn't know what was about to happen to him. Maggie took her son into the same bathroom, the same bathtub where his sisters had died less than 2 hours earlier, and she drowned him too, her only son, 8 years old. When police arrived at the Young residence later that day, they encountered a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their careers. In one bedroom, they found twin beds. On one bed, arranged side by side, were the bodies of 4 little girls: Jessica, Jeanette, Judith, Janice, still wet from the bathtub, still nude, their small bodies placed carefully, deliberately. On the other twin bed, alone, lay James Frank Jr., the only boy, also wet, also nude, also dead. 5 children, 5 lives extinguished, all in the span of a few morning hours, all by their own mother's hands, and Maggie Young was still there. She didn't run, she didn't hide. When officers arrived, she confessed immediately. She told them exactly what she had done. She showed no emotion, no remorse in that moment, because in her fractured mind,
transfer papers,
she
Captain.
believed
All
she had
accounted
done
for.
the right
Much
thing.
appreciated, Doctor. We'll
But
proceed
here's
as
where
ordered.
this story becomes even more tragic, because this didn't come out of nowhere. This wasn't a sudden snap. This was a descent that had been happening for months, for years perhaps, and people had noticed. The signs were there. Captain James Young would later describe the changes he had witnessed in his wife. It started subtly. Maggie became unhappy. She felt inadequate as a mother. She was constantly exhausted, sleeping during the day, going to bed in her clothing rather than changing into night clothes. Her behavior slowly changed. Nothing James did was right. Nothing the children did was right. She became increasingly critical, increasingly withdrawn. The exhaustion grew worse. Maggie stopped being able to care for the 5 youngest children. Her 2 adult daughters from her previous marriage had to step in, taking over the care of their half-siblings. But eventually, they had their own lives to live, their own households to manage. James Young would come home from work to find his infant children in dirty diapers, in wet diapers, crying and uncared for. Maggie would be in bed, unable or unwilling to tend to them. James would have to change them himself, bathe them himself, get them ready for bed himself, while his wife remained in the bedroom, disconnected from reality. Then the delusions began, the hallucinations. One night, Maggie disappeared for 3 hours. When she finally came home, she told James she had been to church. She said God had spoken to her directly. God had told her that her husband was Jesus Christ, that his grandmother had been the Blessed Mother Mary. These weren't the words of a woman who was simply tired or stressed. These were the words of someone experiencing a psychotic break. A few days after that incident, James was preparing to leave for work. He tried to open the front door. Maggie attacked him with a broom, screaming that they were out there, that they had come to kill her. She was terrified of something that didn't exist. James Young knew in that moment that his wife needed help, serious help. He took the day off from work. He tried to have her committed to a hospital, but he learned that she would have to enter voluntarily. She couldn't be forced unless she was an immediate danger to herself or others, an immediate danger. Those words would echo with terrible irony in the months to come. With the help of their priest and their doctor, James convinced Maggie to voluntarily admit herself to Tripler Army Medical Center for psychiatric treatment. She stayed there for at least a month, possibly 6 weeks. She received treatment, she was evaluated, she was medicated. And then one day the psychiatrist told James Young something that would change everything. He said there was nothing more he could do for Maggie at the hospital. Any improvement, he said, would have to come at home. So Maggie Young was sent home, back to the house on Nalapaka Place, back to her 5 young children, back to the pressures and triggers that had caused her breakdown in the first place. Within weeks, all 5 of those children would be dead. Captain James Young was away on a flying mission when it happened. He received word that something terrible had occurred at his home. When he learned what his wife had done, when he learned that all 5 of his youngest children had been drowned, his world collapsed. Imagine being that father. Imagine being away at work, serving your country, trusting that your family is safe at home, and then learning that they're gone, all of them, and that the person who killed them was the woman you loved, the mother of your children, the woman you had tried to help. Maggie Young was arrested and charged with first-degree murder, specifically for the death of her son, James Frank Jr., though she had confessed to killing all 5 children. But the case would never go to trial. A panel of court-appointed psychiatrists evaluated Maggie. They determined that she had been acting under what they called a diseased and deranged condition. She was not fit to stand trial. She was not legally responsible for her actions because she had not been mentally capable of understanding right from wrong at the time. Hawaii's justice system, to its credit, recognized that this was not a case of malicious murder. This was a case of severe mental illness. Maggie Young was not a monster. She was a sick woman who had not received adequate treatment. She was committed to the Hawaii State Hospital in Kaneohe. She began receiving intensive psychiatric care, medication, therapy, treatment, and slowly, gradually, tragically, the treatment began to work. As her mind cleared, as the fog of psychosis lifted, as she returned to reality, Maggie Young began to understand something terrible. She began to remember what she had done. She began to comprehend that she had killed her own children, that Jessica, Jeanette, Judith, Janice, and James Jr. were gone, that she had been the one who took them, that their blood was on her hands. According to hospital administrator Audrey Mertz at the time, Maggie had just started responding to her treatment. She was beginning to grasp the enormity of her actions, and that realization was destroying her. On July 25, 1966, about 6 months after being committed to the hospital, Maggie Young was given a pass to walk the hospital grounds alone. It was a sign of progress, of trust, of hope that she was improving. She never came back from that walk. Hospital staff searched for her. They found her in a chicken slaughtering shed in the hospital's farm area. She had fashioned a noose from available materials. She had hung herself from the rafters. Maggie Young was dead by her own hand, unable to live with the truth of what she had done. So we're left with questions, difficult questions, uncomfortable questions, questions that still echo today, decades later. Could this have been prevented? If Maggie Young had received more intensive treatment at Tripler Army Medical Center, would those 5 children still be alive? If she had been kept in the hospital longer, monitored more closely, given stronger medication, would November 22, 1965 have been just another normal day? What about the warning signs? James Young had seen his wife deteriorating for months. He had witnessed the delusions, the paranoia, the complete inability to function. He had tried to get her help. But was it enough? Could more have been done? And what about the medical community? In 1965, postpartum depression was not well understood. The progression from postpartum depression to postpartum psychosis to full paranoid schizophrenia was not on most doctors' radars. Mental illness carried a stigma. Treatment was limited. But that doesn't excuse the fact that a woman who was clearly, obviously dangerously mentally ill was released from a psychiatric hospital and sent home to care for 5 young children. James Young never stopped mourning his children. He buried them at Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery in San Antonio, Texas. 5 small graves, 5 lives cut short. He eventually remarried. though he never had more children. He moved to the mainland, trying to build a new life while carrying the unbearable weight of his loss. In the years after, James Young would experience anger whenever he saw someone mistreating a child in public. He wanted to tell those parents to cherish their children, to appreciate every moment because time with them might be shorter than they think. Holidays became torture. Thanksgiving, the day he had traveled with his children's bodies to Texas for burial. Christmas, which he said is for children, and without them is never the same. He would still cry decades later. The tears came less frequently, but they still came. There is no such thing as closure when you lose 5 children in a single day. This case should have been a watershed moment in how we understand and treat postpartum depression and postpartum psychosis. But it wasn't. Not really. Because decades later, similar tragedies continued to happen. In 2001, in Houston, Texas, a woman named Andrea Yates drowned her 5 children in a bathtub. The parallels to the Maggie Young case were eerie, horrifying. Andrea Yates, like Maggie Young, had been hospitalized for mental illness before the killings. Like Maggie Young, she had been sent home. Like Maggie Young, she had arranged her children's bodies on beds after drowning them. Like Maggie Young, she confessed immediately. When James Young, then 72 years old, read about the Andrea Yates case, he felt compelled to speak out. For a man who had remained intensely private for decades, who had tried to move past his trauma, the Yates case brought everything flooding back. He reached out to Russell Yates, Andrea's husband, 2 fathers united by the most unimaginable pain, 2 men who understood what it meant to love a woman who had killed their children while in the grip of mental illness. James Young told Russell Yates to keep his faith, to not be ashamed to cry, to be prepared to cope with the pain for the rest of his life. He warned him that there is no closure. The grief never truly ends. And James Young had a message for the public, for the medical community, for anyone who would listen. He wrote that Andrea Yates, like his wife Maggie, did not need to be in prison. She needed medical treatment. These women were not criminals. They were victims of a terrible illness that was not recognized, not treated, not taken seriously enough. A tragedy resulting from this illness must not occur again, Young wrote. There must be better awareness of the seriousness of this illness. And so we return to the question that opened this story. What happened on November 22, 1965, in Aiea, Hawaii? Yes, 5 children died. Yes, they were killed by their mother. Yes, it was one of the worst crimes in Hawaii's history. But it was also something else. It was a preventable tragedy. It was a failure of a medical system that didn't understand the deadly serious nature of postpartum depression and psychosis. It was a failure to recognize warning signs that were screaming for attention. It was a failure to provide adequate treatment and follow-up care for a woman who was clearly, desperately ill. Maggie Young was not evil. She was sick, severely, dangerously sick. And when she was finally getting treatment, when she was finally beginning to understand reality again, the weight of what she had done was so crushing that she could not bear to live. 5 children lost their lives. A mother lost her sanity and then her life. A father lost everything. A community was scarred forever. Today we understand postpartum depression better. We have better treatments, better awareness, better support systems. But it's still not enough. Women still suffer in silence. Mental illness still carries stigma. Warning signs are still missed. The bodies of Jessica Young, Jeanette Young, Judith Young, Janice Young, and James Frank Young, Jr. lie in Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. 5 small graves, 5 lives that should have been lived. Their story is not just a tragedy. It's a warning, a reminder that mental illness is real, that it can be deadly, and that we must do better at recognizing it, treating it, and supporting those who suffer from it before tragedy strikes. What happened on Nalapaka Place in Aiea on that November day in 1965 can never be undone. Those children can never be brought back. But their story can serve a purpose. It can remind us to pay attention, to take mental illness seriously, to provide treatment before it's too late. The questions remain. Could it have been prevented? What more could have been done? And perhaps most haunting of all, how many other Maggie Youngs are out there right now, struggling in silence, descending into darkness, waiting for help that may never come. This has been a special investigative report on the Aya tragedy of 1965, a case that remains a mystery wrapped in mental illness, wrapped in preventable tragedy. May those 5 children rest in peace, and may their story never be forgotten. On a quiet street in Norman, Oklahoma, a house burned while a killer spent the victim's money just miles away. A robbery turned execution, a fire meant to erase the truth, and a conspiracy that investigators believe was never fully uncovered. I'm bringing you a disturbing investigation tonight that spans years of deception, manipulation, and cold-blooded murder. This is the second story of Elaine K. Young, a Missouri schoolteacher who lived a double life and whose trail of destruction would ultimately lead investigators to uncover one of the most calculated murder-for-hire plots in the state's history. What you're about to hear is not fiction. It's not exaggerated for dramatic effect. This is a true account of how greed, manipulation, and a complete absence of conscience can transform an ordinary person into something monstrous. And it all happened in the quiet farmlands of Missouri, where neighbors trusted neighbors, and no one suspected the evil living among them. The date was March 23, 2006, in the small farming community of Novinger, Missouri, a town of just over 1,000 residents where everyone knows everyone. A frantic 911 call shattered the early morning silence at exactly 2:01 a.m. Catherine Mock, her voice breaking with sobs, her words barely intelligible, reported finding her friend's husband with what she described as a big hole in the side of his face. The victim was Melvin Bo Griesbauer, a 48-year-old Army Reserve specialist, a man who had put his life on the line for his country. He had survived a dangerous tour of duty in Iraq, navigating IEDs and enemy fire, only to return home to what should have been safety, only to die violently in his own home, on his own farm, surrounded by the life he had built. When first responders arrived at the rural property in Adair County that cold March morning, they found a scene that would haunt them for years to come. Griesbauer's body lay in the barn area, a fatal gunshot wound to the head. His wife, Elaine K. Young, and her friend Catherine Mock were there, both appearing distraught and shaken. The initial impression was tragic, perhaps a suicide, perhaps a terrible accident during late-night farm work. But seasoned investigators know that first impressions can be deceiving. And as the sun rose over that Missouri farm, as forensic teams began their meticulous work, nothing about this death started to make sense. At first glance, investigators considered the possibility of suicide. A man, perhaps struggling with the aftermath of war, taking his own life in a moment of despair, or maybe an accident, a rifle misfiring in the darkness. But as they examined the scene more closely, the evidence told a different story, a much darker story. The rifle used to kill Griesbauer, a .30-30 Winchester caliber weapon, had been cocked after he was shot. Think about that for a moment. The weapon was prepared to fire again after the fatal bullet had already been discharged, an impossible feat for a man already dead. This was no suicide. This was no accident. And then, on the side of the barn, partially hidden but not hidden enough, they made a chilling discovery, a ski mask and a pair of rubber gloves. Both items were contaminated with gunshot residue, the microscopic particles that spray out when a firearm is discharged. Someone had worn these items while shooting Griesbauer, then discarded them in a hasty attempt to hide the evidence. The DNA found on these items would crack this case wide open and lead investigators down a rabbit hole of conspiracy, greed, and calculated evil. One DNA profile belonged to Catherine Mock, the friend who made that tearful 911 call. Her genetic material was found on the gloves, mixed with the gunshot residue that proved she had been near the weapon when it was fired. The other profile belonged to Elaine K. Young, Griesbauer's wife, his supposed partner, the woman who should have been devastated by his death. But this wasn't just a crime of passion or a marriage that had gone violently wrong. What investigators would uncover was far more sinister, far more calculated, far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. So who was Elaine K. Young? To understand this case, we need to understand the woman at its center. Born in 1945, by 2006, Young was 61 years old and working as a teacher in various Missouri school districts. To those who knew her professionally, she seemed dedicated to education. To her neighbors, she was a farm owner, someone trying to make a living through agriculture and a dog breeding business. She appeared to be just another member of the tight-knit rural community, hardworking, struggling perhaps, but ordinary. But Elaine K. Young was anything but ordinary. Behind the facade of the dedicated teacher and struggling farmer was a woman with a dark history, a woman who had been married 4 times, and a woman who saw other people not as human beings but as obstacles or opportunities. By early 2006, Young was in severe financial trouble. The farm was hemorrhaging money. The dog breeding business wasn't generating enough income. Debts were mounting. And according to prosecutors, Young became obsessed, not with finding legitimate solutions to her financial problems, but with keeping the farm at any cost at all. Her solution wasn't hard work. It wasn't downsizing or filing for bankruptcy protection. It wasn't asking family for help or selling off assets. Her solution was far more permanent, far more lucrative, and far more evil. Her solution was murder. You see, Melvin Bo Griesbauer was worth more to Elaine Young dead than alive. Much more. Prosecutors would later reveal that Young had meticulously researched and planned her husband's death to collect on multiple insurance policies that totaled a staggering $1.2 million. Let me break down that figure for you because it reveals just how calculated this plot was. Griesbauer had a $600,000 basic life insurance policy issued by the Army and Air Force Mutual Aid Association, a benefit of his service in the United States Army National Guard. He was a dedicated soldier, and like many service members, he had taken out substantial life insurance to ensure his wife would be cared for if he died in combat. The irony is devastating. He protected himself against the dangers of war, never imagining that the real threat was waiting for him at home. But Young wasn't content with just that policy. She had enrolled Griesbauer in a $37,500 accidental death and dismemberment insurance policy through Monumental Life Insurance Company, connected to her employment at the Milan schools and her association with the Missouri State Teachers Association. And there was more. They had both enrolled in yet another accidental death and dismemberment insurance policy for $100,000 through Continental Casualty Company, a subsidiary of CNA. Young had made sure that she was the beneficiary on every single policy. In her mind, Griesbauer had become a financial asset to be liquidated. But even the coldest, most calculating killer usually can't commit murder alone. Young needed help. She needed someone she could trust, someone she could manipulate, someone desperate or damaged enough to go along with an unthinkable plan. She found that person in Catherine Mock. Catherine Mock was 58 years old in 2006, living in Cassville, Missouri, about 250 miles south of Novinger. How she and Young became friends isn't entirely clear from the court records, but what is clear is that Young knew exactly how to manipulate her. According to testimony presented at trial, Young told Mock that Griesbauer was abusive. She claimed he beat her. She said he had taken out a $300,000 insurance policy on her life, implying that she was in danger, that he might kill her. Whether any of this was true, we'll never know for certain. But it worked. Mock, apparently convinced that she was helping her friend escape an abusive situation, agreed to help find someone to kill Griesbauer. The evidence presented at trial painted a disturbing picture of the conspiracy that followed. Mock allegedly approached at least 2 of her relatives, asking if they knew anyone who would kill for money. She offered $6,000 to one person, then $10,000 to another. Both refused, perhaps sensing something fundamentally wrong about the request, perhaps simply unwilling to commit murder for any price. Imagine being approached by a family member with such a request. Imagine the shock, the horror, the terrible knowledge that someone you know is planning murder. Both of these individuals would later testify against Mock and Young, their testimony forming a crucial part of the prosecution's case. When hiring a hitman failed, when Mock couldn't find anyone willing to pull the trigger for cash, the 2 women apparently made a fateful decision. If they couldn't find a killer, they would become killers themselves. Now we come to the night of March 22, 2006. the night everything had been building toward, the night when planning turned into action, when conspiracy became murder. Catherine Mock traveled from her home in Cassville to stay at the Young farm in Novinger. The stated reason for her visit is lost to history. Perhaps she was just visiting a friend, perhaps helping with farm work. But prosecutors believe she was there for one reason only, to help kill Melvin Griesbauer. That evening, Elaine Young drove to Kirksville, the larger town nearby, to pick up her husband from his work shift. It was a routine trip, something she had done countless times before. Griesbauer had no idea that this drive home would be his last. He had no idea that his wife and her friend were waiting for him. He had no idea that the life insurance policies he had taken out to protect his wife had signed his death warrant. According to the federal indictment and the evidence presented at trial, when Young and Griesbauer returned home in the late evening hours of March 22nd or the early morning hours of March 23rd, Mock and Young executed their plan. Griesbauer was shot in the head with a .30-30 Winchester rifle, a weapon that had previously belonged to Young's family, a weapon she knew how to use, a weapon that had probably sat in that barn for years waiting for its moment of terrible purpose. The ballistic evidence, the placement of the body, the trajectory of the bullet, all of it pointed to murder. And the DNA evidence on that ski mask and those gloves tied both women directly to the shooting. But even in murder, even with their victim dead at their feet, Young and Mock weren't done with their deception. The two women tried desperately to make it look like suicide or an accident. They positioned the body. They staged the scene. They prepared their story. And then, at 2:01 in the morning, Mock made that tearful 911 call, her voice breaking with what sounded like genuine shock and grief. But investigators weren't fooled. The cocked rifle gave them away. The hidden ski mask and gloves gave them away. And as the investigation deepened, as federal authorities joined forces with local law enforcement, the full scope of Young's evil began to emerge. Because this wasn't Young's first attempt at murder for hire, not even close. As prosecutors dug into her past, they uncovered a pattern of deadly intentions stretching back over a decade. A pattern that suggested Griesbauer wasn't an aberration, but the culmination of years of murderous planning. In 1994, 12 years before Griesbauer's death, Young allegedly solicited two different men to kill her second husband, Frank Neese. The motive? Insurance money exceeding $300,000. Both men refused. Frank Neese lived, though one has to wonder if he ever knew how close to death he came. Between 1996 and 2003, during her marriage to her third husband, David Crawford, Young reportedly asked both a man and a woman to help kill Crawford. Again, she was refused. Again, her husband survived, though the marriage eventually ended in divorce in 2003. And then there was her mother. In the year 2000, Young's mother died under circumstances that investigators came to find deeply suspicious. They believed, though she was never charged for this crime, that Young had killed her own mother by injecting her with a lethal dose of morphine and then smothering her with a pillow to ensure death. Her own mother, the woman who gave her life, allegedly murdered, possibly for inheritance, possibly for insurance, possibly for reasons we'll never fully understand. Griesbauer was Young's fourth husband. Think about that. 4 husbands. Multiple attempts to have them killed, 1 successful murder, 1 dead mother, a trail of destruction spanning decades. One has to wonder, what happened to all those previous husbands? Were they simply lucky to escape with their lives? Did they see warning signs and flee? Or were there other victims we'll never know about, deaths that were successfully disguised as accidents or natural causes? As the federal investigation intensified in the months and years following Griesbauer's death, more evidence emerged that demonstrated just how calculated and cold-blooded Elaine Young truly was. Among her possessions, investigators found handwritten notes that were nothing short of chilling. These weren't random jottings or innocent reminders. These were the blueprints of murder and its cover-up, written in Young's own hand. One note read, "Use her drugged state to convince her she shot him." Another stated, "Offered $10,000 to kill him, was turned down." Do you understand what these notes reveal? Young wasn't just planning to kill her husband. She was planning to frame Mock for the murder. or at minimum to create plausible deniability for herself. She was already thinking several steps ahead, already planning how to escape justice while her accomplice took the fall, and the manipulation didn't stop with the murder. After Griesbauer was dead, after the 911 call had been made and the investigation had begun, Young allegedly gave mock pills containing hydrocodone and acetaminophen, prescription painkillers. She instructed Mock to overdose on these pills, telling her that if she appeared to have mental health issues, she would be sent to a mental hospital instead of prison. Young was trying to create an insanity defense for Mock, trying to make her appear unstable and unreliable as a witness. It was another layer of manipulation, another attempt to escape justice by sacrificing her friend. Mock, to her credit, didn't follow through. But the fact that Young even suggested it reveals the depth of her callousness, her willingness to destroy anyone who could implicate her. In the weeks following the murder, Young began the process of collecting on those insurance policies. Beginning in late March 2006, she used facilities in interstate commerce and the United States Mail to process the insurance claims. She filled out forms. She submitted death certificates. She communicated with insurance companies. She did everything a grieving widow would do to collect on her deceased husband's policies. But the insurance companies, working with federal investigators, held off on paying the claims. They suspected fraud. They suspected murder. And they were absolutely right. Then, in April 2009, more than 3 years after the murder, Young did something that demonstrated she knew exactly how much trouble she was in. She mailed letters to potential witnesses, letters that contained instructions that were both desperate and revealing. In these letters, Young directed the recipients not to disclose her ability to escape from custody. She gave them instructions on how to communicate regarding her ability to escape and travel to a non-extradition country. Elaine Young was planning to flee the country. She was preparing to run to a nation that wouldn't send her back to the United States to face trial. She was ready to abandon everything, her farm, her life, her identity, rather than face justice for what she had done. But federal investigators intercepted these communications. The net was closing. And on October 23, 2009, more than 3.5 years after Melvin Griesbauer's murder, Elaine K. Young and Catherine Mock were arrested and charged with federal conspiracy to commit murder for hire. The case took years to build, and for good reason. This wasn't a simple murder case that could be prosecuted in state court. This was a federal case involving multiple jurisdictions, insurance fraud, conspiracy, and murder for hire. The United States Attorney's Office, working with the Adair County Sheriff's Office, the Barry County Sheriff's Office, the Missouri State Highway Patrol, and the FBI's Kirksville office, built an airtight case. The evidence was overwhelming. DNA evidence, ballistic evidence, testimony from Mock's relatives about her attempts to hire a killer, handwritten notes in Young's possession, insurance documents, phone records, financial records showing Young's desperate financial situation, witness testimony about Young's previous attempts to hire killers for her earlier husbands. The trial began in March 2012 in the United States District Court for the Eastern District of Missouri before Judge Henry Autry. It lasted 6 days, 6 days of testimony, evidence, and the slow, methodical presentation of facts that painted an unmistakable picture of guilt. Assistant U.S. Attorneys Tom Dittmeyer, Michael Riley, and Patrick Judge prosecuted the case. They presented more than 60 witnesses and hundreds of pieces of evidence. They walked the jury through the conspiracy, step by step, showing exactly how Young had recruited Mock, how they had attempted to hire a killer, how they had ultimately committed the murder themselves, and how they had tried to cover it up. The defense attorneys for both women fought hard. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial. They questioned the credibility of witnesses. They suggested alternative theories. But even they seemed to know they were fighting a losing battle. On March 19, 2012, after deliberating on the evidence, the jury returned their verdict: guilty. Both women were convicted on all counts: 1 count of conspiracy to commit murder for hire and 1 count of murder for hire. Each count carried a maximum penalty of life in prison. Catherine Mock broke down when she heard the verdict. The tears flowed freely. Whether they were tears of remorse or simply fear of spending the rest of her life behind bars, we cannot know. Elaine K. Young said nothing. Her face remained blank, expressionless. She showed no reaction whatsoever when the verdict was read, the same emotionless mask she had maintained throughout the entire trial. Even in her moment of final judgment, she gave nothing away. Sentencing came 3 months later, on June 17, 2012. Both women were brought before Judge Autry to hear their fate. Catherine Mock spoke first. She broke down again, apologizing through tears. She said that she prayed for Griesbauer's family every night. She claimed she would have taken his place the night of the murder if she could. Her lawyers continued to maintain her innocence, but the words rang hollow in the face of the overwhelming evidence. Then came Elaine K. Young's turn. The courtroom waited. Would she finally speak? Would she show any remorse? Would she explain why she had done what she had done? She said nothing. Absolutely nothing. She stood in silence as the judge prepared to pass sentence, her face still blank, her eyes revealing nothing of what was going on behind them. Judge Autry made clear that the premeditation, the manipulation, the callous disregard for human life, and the complete absence of remorse warranted the harshest punishment available under federal law. Both women were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Life. The rest of their days behind bars. No chance of freedom, no chance of redemption, just decades of incarceration until death finally comes. And so tonight, as I bring you this story, Elaine K. Young sits in a federal prison somewhere in the United States. She is now in her late 70s, an elderly woman who will die behind bars. Her teaching career is over, her farm is gone. Her life of deception and manipulation has ended in a small cell with iron bars and concrete walls. Catherine Mock is there too, in her own cell, living out her own life sentence. But questions remain. So many questions. How many times did Elaine Young try to orchestrate murder before she finally succeeded? We know of at least 3 previous attempts, 2 on former husbands, 1 on her mother. But were there others? Were there other people she tried to recruit as killers? Were there other plots that never came to light? What really happened to her mother in 2000? Young was never charged with that death, but investigators clearly believed it was murder. Did she kill her own mother? And if so, how did she live with that knowledge for 6 years before killing again? What about her previous husbands, Frank Neese and David Crawford? They survived, but did they know how close to death they came? Did they ever suspect? Do they live their lives now knowing that the woman they once loved, the woman they shared a bed with, wanted them dead? And perhaps most haunting of all, what drove a schoolteacher, someone entrusted with shaping young minds, someone who stood in front of classrooms and taught children, to become a calculating killer? What breaks inside a person's soul that allows them to see other human beings as nothing more than financial assets to be liquidated? The farm Young was so obsessed with saving is long gone, sold off to pay debts and legal fees. The dog breeding business she tried so desperately to preserve no longer exists. The insurance money she killed for, she never received a single dollar of that $1.2 million. Not 1 cent. All that remains is the memory of Melvin Bo Griesbauer, a soldier, a husband, a man who survived the dangers of war in Iraq only to be killed in his own home by the woman who had promised to love and cherish him. His family still mourns him, his friends still remember him, and his death stands as a stark reminder that sometimes the most dangerous person in your life is the one who knows you best. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about greed, about the capacity for evil that can hide behind an ordinary face, about how someone can stand in front of a classroom teaching children one day and plan cold-blooded murder the next. Elaine Young wore many masks in her life, teacher, farmer, wife, but beneath all those masks was something cold and calculating, something that saw other people not as individuals with hopes and dreams and families who loved them, but as obstacles or opportunities. She thought she could get away with it. She thought she could commit the perfect murder, collect the insurance money, and continue living her life. She thought she was smarter than the investigators, more clever than the system. She was wrong. Some mysteries are never fully solved. Some darkness never completely comes to light. And sometimes, even after justice is served, questions remain that will never be answered. Tonight, those questions linger in the air. How many victims were there really? What other crimes might Elaine Young have committed? And what turned a schoolteacher into a serial plotter of murders? We may never know the full truth. But what we do know is this. Melvin Griesbauer is gone, taken from this world far too soon. 2 women are spending the rest of their lives in prison. And somewhere in rural Missouri, a farm stands empty, a silent monument to greed, betrayal, and murder. This has been a special investigation into one of Missouri's most disturbing murder-for-hire cases. This is the story of Elaine K. Young, the deadly teacher of Novinger, Missouri, whose obsession with money led her down a path from which there was no return. Remember Melvin Bo Griesbauer tonight. Remember that he was more than a victim in a true crime story. He was a soldier, a husband, a human being who deserved better than the fate that awaited him. What do you do when the man who is supposed to protect you is the one threatening your life, and the system refuses to listen? Tonight, the case of Donna Yaklich, a battered woman who crossed a line, and paid a heavier price than the men who pulled the trigger. The third case, a story that continues to echo through the streets of Norman, Oklahoma, a story of betrayal, violence, and questions that remain unanswered more than a decade later. This is a case that shook a quiet neighborhood to its core, a crime so meticulously cruel, so coldly calculated, that even seasoned investigators found themselves struggling to comprehend the depths of human desperation and darkness. Tonight, we examine the case of Mary Courtney York, a name that became forever linked to one of Cleveland County's most haunting murders, a 19-year-old woman whose choices on a cold February day would alter the course of multiple lives forever. This is the story of what happened at 619 Villa Drive, a story of fire, blood, and secrets that some say have never fully come to light. February 13th, 2013. It was a Wednesday morning that began like any other in the quiet residential neighborhood of Villa Drive in Norman, Oklahoma. Families were going about their routines. Children were at school. The winter chill hung in the air. But shortly before 11 o'clock, something changed. Neighbors began to notice smoke. Not the gentle wisp from a fireplace, but thick, black, ominous clouds billowing from a house in the middle of their block. Number 6019 Villa Drive, the home of Patrick Burton. Multiple calls flooded into emergency services. The fire department responded immediately, their trucks screaming through the normally peaceful streets. When firefighters arrived on scene, they found the house engulfed in angry flames that seemed to consume everything in their path. Working quickly and courageously, firefighters battled the blaze. But as they pushed deeper into the structure, they made a discovery that would transform this from a routine fire response into something far more sinister. Inside the burning home, they found a body. Patrick Burton, 51 years old, lay dead amid the flames and smoke. This was his house. These were his belongings scattered and destroyed around him. But this wasn't a tragic accident. This wasn't a man who had perished trying to escape a fire. The scene told a different story entirely. As the flames were extinguished and investigators began their preliminary examination, the evidence became impossible to ignore. The house had been ransacked, drawers pulled open, belongings strewn about, the unmistakable signs of a search for valuables. Burton's pickup truck, normally parked outside, was nowhere to be found. And then came the most chilling discovery of all. Patrick Burton hadn't died from smoke inhalation. He hadn't been trapped by flames. He had been shot, murdered. And then, in what prosecutors would later describe as a calculated attempt to destroy evidence, his killers had poured an accelerant around his body and set him ablaze. This wasn't a house fire. This was a crime scene. And somewhere out there, Burton's killers were on the run. Before we go further into this investigation, we need to understand who Patrick Burton was. Because in cases like these, it's easy for victims to become statistics, to become nameless figures in a larger narrative of crime and punishment. Patrick Burton was a real person, a man with a life, with routines, with people who cared about him. At 51 years old, Burton lived alone in his Villa Drive home. He was known to neighbors as quiet, unassuming. the kind of person who kept to himself but was never unfriendly. He had his routines, his life, his small corner of Norman where he felt safe. But Burton's life intersected with people whose worlds were very different from his own. And it was these intersections, these connections that on the surface seemed innocent enough, that would ultimately lead to his death. What we know now, what the investigation would later reveal, is that Patrick Burton had a history of showing generosity to people he encountered. He gave money to those who asked. He helped people who claimed they needed help. By all accounts, he was someone who tried to see the good in others, even when perhaps he shouldn't have. And among those people he had helped was a young woman named Mary Courtney York. The details of their relationship would become crucial to understanding what happened on that February morning. Cell phone records would later show that York had been in contact with Burton regularly. She knew where he lived, she knew his routines, she knew he had money, and she knew he trusted her. On the evening of February 12th, just hours before his death, Patrick Burton spoke to Mary Courtney York on his cell phone. It would be the last conversation he would ever have with her, and according to investigators, it may have been the conversation that sealed his fate. In the immediate aftermath of the fire, Norman police faced a challenging investigation. They had a murder victim, a burned crime scene, and very few immediate leads. The truck was missing, the house had been ransacked, and whoever had done this had tried very deliberately to destroy evidence, but they had made mistakes. And those mistakes would unravel everything. Investigators began with what they knew. The house fire had been set intentionally. That much was clear from the burn patterns and the presence of accelerants. Burton had been shot before the fire started. His truck was missing, along with various items from his home. The next break came from an unexpected source. Security footage from the Riverwind Casino, located south of Norman, showed two individuals attempting to use credit cards. Not just any credit cards, Patrick Burton's credit cards. The timestamp on the footage was chilling. These people were spending a dead man's money while his body was still smoldering in the ruins of his home. The images were clear enough to identify. A young woman and a young man, both appearing confident, casual, as if they had every right to be using those cards. Investigators ran the images through their databases and quickly identified the pair, Mary Courtney York, 19 years old, and Christopher Cody King, 24, both from Del City, Oklahoma. But the evidence didn't stop there. Additional surveillance footage surfaced from an Oklahoma City hotel. The same two people, and parked outside, Patrick Burton's missing pickup truck. The investigation accelerated rapidly. On February 15th, just 2 days after Burton's body was found, police located the stolen truck at 4309 Southeast 55th Street in Oklahoma City. It had been partially stripped. Inside were items stolen from Burton's home, physical evidence directly linking the vehicle to the crime scene. Later that same day, police moved in for the arrest. At the intersection of Southeast 29th and Sunny Lane Road in Del City, officers apprehended Mary Courtney York and Christopher Cody King, the two suspects who had been caught on camera spending their victim's money, driving his truck, living off the proceeds of his murder. But as investigators interrogated the pair, the story became even more complex. This wasn't a random crime. This wasn't a case of strangers breaking into a house. Mary Courtney York admitted to investigators that she knew Patrick Burton. She knew him well. In fact, she told police that Burton had given her money in the past, that he had been, in her words, someone who helped her. The investigation revealed that York had been running an online advertisement for escort services. Burton, it appeared, had been one of her clients, or at the very least, someone she had contact with through that world, and here's where the story takes its darkest turn. According to York's own statement to police, she had followed Burton to a bank on the evening of February 12th so he could withdraw money. She knew his movements. She knew his routine. She knew when he would have cash on hand. The next morning, she and Christopher Cody King went to his home. York told investigators she was present when King shot Patrick Burton. She claimed there was a struggle, that Burton fought back when King attempted to rob him. In that struggle, King pulled the trigger. York insisted she wasn't present when the fire was set, when Burton's body was doused with accelerant and set ablaze. But investigators had their doubts. the coordination, the planning, the deliberate destruction of evidence. This suggested something more than one person acting alone. As the investigation continued, it became clear that Mary Courtney York and Christopher Cody King had not acted entirely alone. The web of complicity extended further than anyone initially realized. 3 additional men would eventually be connected to the crime, each playing their own role in the conspiracy that ended Patrick Burton's life. Justin Tyler Dewberry, 27 years old, from Oklahoma City; Michael Dwayne Walker, 26, from Midwest City; and Jeremy Allen Smith, 27, also from Oklahoma City. 3 men whose names would be added to the court documents, whose choices would forever link them to this tragedy. These men were charged as accessories to murder. Their alleged crimes: helping York and King escape the scene, assisting in the disposal of evidence, being part of a coordinated effort to cover up what had happened at 619 Villa Drive. The investigation revealed that after Burton's murder, multiple people worked together to hide the crime. Some helped dispose of Burton's truck. Others may have helped clean up evidence or provided alibis. The exact details of each person's involvement varied, but the pattern was clear. This was a group effort to evade justice. Surveillance footage from the casino showed not just York and King, but Dewberry and Walker as well, all together, attempting to use Burton's credit cards. They were celebrating in their own way, spending money that had been stolen from a dead man. Smith's involvement came through his connection to Burton's pickup truck. Investigators traced the vehicle's movements after the murder and found that Smith had participated in efforts to strip and dispose of it. But here's what made investigators uncomfortable, what kept them up at night as they built their case. The evidence suggested there might have been even more people involved. Shadowy figures on the periphery of the investigation. People whose names never made it into official charges. Individuals who may have known what was going to happen or who helped afterward, but who slipped through the cracks of the justice system. Court documents noted that evidence indicated others may have been involved, though no additional names were released. No other arrests were made. To this day, investigators believe there are people out there who know more about what happened to Patrick Burton than they've ever told. People who carry secrets about that February morning. People who have never been held accountable. The wheels of justice began to turn, though as any observer of the legal system knows, they turn slowly. Christopher Cody King was the first to face formal sentencing. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder, accepting responsibility for pulling the trigger that ended Patrick Burton's life. In addition to the murder charge, King also pleaded guilty to arson and to larceny of a motor vehicle. His sentence was severe and unambiguous: life in prison without the possibility of parole. Additionally, he received 35 years for arson and 20 years for the vehicle theft. King would spend the rest of his life behind bars. Mary Courtney York's path through the legal system followed shortly after. She too decided to plead guilty rather than face a trial. On the charge of first-degree murder, York admitted her role in the conspiracy that led to Burton's death. On May 30th, 2014, more than a year after Patrick Burton's murder, York stood before Cleveland County District Judge Lori Walkley for sentencing. The courtroom was quiet as Judge Walkley announced the sentence: life in prison. But with a crucial caveat: the last 22 years of that life sentence would be suspended. This meant that York would be required to serve 85% of the first 23 years of her sentence before becoming eligible for release. The mathematics of incarceration are cold and precise. 85% of 23 years equals just over 19 and a half years. York, who was 21 years old at the time of her sentencing, would be in her early 40s before she could even be considered for release. Additionally, Judge Walkley sentenced York to 35 years on the arson charge, with all but 2 years suspended. The sentences would run concurrently, meaning the life sentence would be the controlling factor in determining when York might someday walk free. The 3 accessories, Dewberry, Walker, and Smith, received far lighter sentences. Each man was given a 10-year suspended sentence for their roles in helping York and King escape and disposing of evidence. Suspended sentences meant they would serve no actual prison time unless they violated the terms of their probation. They would walk free while York sat in a prison cell. They would rebuild their lives while Patrick Burton's family continued to grieve. The disparity in sentences raised questions about justice, about accountability, about whether the punishment truly fit the crime for all involved. As I've researched this case, as I've pored over court documents and police reports and news coverage from that time, certain questions continue to haunt me. Questions that, I suspect, haunt the investigators who worked this case as well. Why did Mary Courtney York, a 19-year-old woman who by all accounts knew Patrick Burton and had received help from him in the past, decide to participate in his murder? What combination of desperation, greed, or influence led her to betray someone who had shown her kindness? The simple answer is money. Burton had money. York and King wanted it. They planned a robbery, and when Burton fought back, they killed him. But is it really that simple? Court records indicate that York was running an escort service advertisement online. Burton had given her money before. There was clearly some kind of relationship there, some kind of transaction or understanding between them. Did York see him as a target because she knew his vulnerabilities? Did she calculate that his life was worth less than whatever cash and credit cards they could steal? Or was there more to the story that never came out in court? And what about the others? The investigation suggested that additional people were involved beyond the 5 who were charged. Who were they? What did they know? What did they do? Were there people who knew the robbery was being planned but said nothing? Were there individuals who helped afterward, who provided shelter or transportation or alibis, who have never faced any consequences? The court documents hint at this broader conspiracy, but the details remain frustratingly vague. Evidence indicated others may have been involved, but no names, no additional arrests, just the suggestion that somewhere out there, people are walking around with knowledge of Patrick Burton's murder that they've never shared. And perhaps the most haunting question of all, could this have been prevented? Patrick Burton was, by all accounts, a kind man who helped people. But did that kindness make him a target? Did his generosity, his willingness to give money to those who asked, ultimately lead to his death? It's a terrible calculus to consider that the very qualities that make someone good, compassion, generosity, the willingness to help others, might also make them vulnerable to those who would exploit that goodness. There's another dimension to this case that troubles investigators and observers alike. The fire, the deliberate burning of Patrick Burton's body. This wasn't just murder. This was an attempt to erase him, to destroy evidence, to turn a human being into ash and make him disappear. That level of cold calculation, that willingness to set fire to another person's body, speaks to a darkness that's hard to comprehend. Who made that decision? Who poured the accelerant? Who struck the match? York claimed she wasn't there for that part, but investigators have their doubts. And the truth of what happened in those final moments, as Patrick Burton's home became his funeral pyre, may never be fully known. As I sit here tonight, more than a decade has passed since Patrick Burton was murdered in his home on Villa Drive. Mary Courtney York has served years of her sentence in an Oklahoma prison. Christopher Cody King will never see freedom again. The 3 accessories have presumably moved on with their lives, their suspended sentences hanging over them like a sword. But Patrick Burton remains dead. His life, cut short at 51 years old, cannot be restored. His family's grief cannot be erased, and the questions that linger around this case cannot be fully answered. What really happened on February 13th, 2013? We know the broad strokes: a robbery, a shooting, a fire set to cover evidence. We know who was charged and who was convicted. We know the sentences that were handed down. But do we know everything? Do we know everyone who was involved? Do we understand all the decisions and circumstances that led to that moment when Christopher Cody King pulled the trigger? The official investigation is closed. The cases have been adjudicated. Justice, as defined by our legal system, has been served. But in the quiet moments when investigators who worked this case reflect on what they found and what they didn't find, I suspect they think about those unnamed others, the ones who got away, the ones whose involvement was suspected but never proven. There are people out there who know more about Patrick Burton's death than they've ever told anyone. People who carry secrets. People who made choices that day or in the days after that they've never had to answer for. And perhaps that's the most unsettling part of this entire story. Not just that a good man was murdered for his money and his truck, not just that his killers tried to burn away the evidence, but that even now, even after arrests and convictions and sentences, we may not know the full truth. Some cases close neatly, all questions answered, all perpetrators identified and punished, all loose ends tied up. This is not one of those cases. Mary Courtney York sits in prison tonight, serving time for choices she made when she was just 19 years old. Whether she will eventually be released, whether she will rebuild a life on the outside, remains to be seen. But the shadow of what happened at 619 Villa Drive will follow her forever, just as it follows everyone who was touched by this case, just as it haunts the streets of Norman, where neighbors still remember the smoke, the sirens, and the terrible discovery of what lay inside that burning house. Some mysteries are solved completely. Some justice is absolute and final, and some cases, like this one, leave us with questions that may never be fully answered, with suspicions that may never be confirmed, with the unsettling knowledge that somewhere out there, people know more than they're saying. This has been Cold Case Chronicles, the case of Mary Courtney York and the murder of Patrick Burton. A case that reminds us that even when justice is served, the full truth may remain forever in the shadows. Thank you for watching. And remember, in cases like these, someone always knows more than they're telling. Not every killer acts out of hatred. Some act out of fear, some out of desperation, and some because the system meant to save them never showed up. This final case forces us to ask a question with no comfortable answer. When survival becomes a crime, who is really guilty? A story that forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about justice, abuse, and the limits of self-preservation. Tonight we delve into the case of Donna Yaklich, a woman who became both victim and perpetrator in a tragedy that played out in Pueblo, Colorado, nearly 4 decades ago. This is a story where the line between right and wrong blurs into shadow, where the protectors became the abusers, and where desperation led to a decision that would haunt everyone involved. December 12, 1985, a cold winter night in Pueblo, Colorado. Dennis Yaklich, a narcotics detective with the Pueblo Police Department, pulls into his driveway after his shift. At 6'5" and 280 pounds, Dennis is an imposing figure, a weightlifter known for his aggressive tactics on the force. As he steps out of his truck, 2 figures emerge from the darkness. Gunshots shatter the quiet night. Dennis Yaklich falls dead in his own driveway. Inside the house, his wife Donna is sleeping. Or so she claims. The investigation begins immediately. Detectives assume it's connected to Dennis's work in narcotics. Perhaps revenge from a criminal he'd put away. Perhaps retaliation for his notorious roughness on the streets. But the truth would prove far more complicated. After months of dead ends, a tip leads investigators to 2 teenage brothers, Charles and Edward Greenwell. Charles is 16. Edward is 25. And their story leads directly back to Donna Yaklich. She had hired them, paid them $4,200 to kill her husband, but Donna had a story of her own. To understand what happened that December night, we must go back 8 years. April 1977. Donna meets Dennis Yaklich. She's 22, he's 30, a widower with 4 children who desperately need care. Just 3 months earlier, Dennis's first wife, Barbara, had died under circumstances that even then raised eyebrows. The official cause of death, internal bleeding from a lacerated liver. Dennis claimed he accidentally caused the injury while performing CPR after Barbara fainted from diet pills. No crime scene investigation was conducted. No charges were filed. Dennis Yaklich, the police detective, was never seriously questioned. Donna moved in to help with the children. She planned to stay only for the summer, but she fell in love, not with Dennis, but with the children who had lost their mother. Children who were grieving and needed someone. And Dennis? He became abusive within a month. According to Donna's later testimony, the violence was relentless. Slapping, kicking, choking, pushing her downstairs, holding his service weapon to her head. The psychological torture was even worse. keeping her in darkness, striking her without warning, threatening to kill her family if she ever left. Dennis was using steroids to enhance his competitive weightlifting. His colleagues on the force admitted he was out of control. Some said they feared working with him. One supervisor later testified that other officers had threatened to shoot Dennis because they knew they couldn't defend themselves against him any other way. These were trained law enforcement officers, and they were afraid of Dennis Yaklich. So how was Donna, 5'7", 130 pounds, supposed to defend herself? Donna tried to escape. Again and again, she tried. In 1982, she called Dennis's partner, begging for help. She said Dennis had thrown her down the stairs and was threatening to kill her. The detective believed her. He went to their supervisor immediately. The supervisor gestured for him to drop it. None of their business. In 1983, Donna saw a psychologist. She sobbed uncontrollably through the entire session. The psychologist told her to leave Dennis but offered no guidance on how to do it safely. Donna never went back. In February 1984, she fled to a battered women's shelter in Denver. But like so many abused women, she returned when Dennis promised to change. She was so ashamed of going back that she told the shelter counselors she was moving out of state. By early 1985, Donna was telling people she believed Dennis was going to kill her. She reached out for help, for advice, for any intervention. No one took her seriously. In May 1985, sheriff's deputies responded to a 911 call at the Yaklich home. They talked with Dennis. He showed them the gym he'd built on the property. They barely acknowledged Donna. Then they left. The message was clear. Donna was on her own. On the wrong side of what they call the blue wall, the code of silence that protects police officers, even the dangerous ones. Donna tried to kill herself, but thoughts of her young son stopped her. She couldn't leave him motherless the way Dennis's children had been left motherless. So she began asking a neighbor, Edward Greenwell, if he knew anyone who could get rid of Dennis before Dennis killed her. The trial of Donna Yaklich became a battleground over a controversial legal concept, battered woman syndrome. Her defense team argued that Donna had been so terrorized, so psychologically trapped, that hiring someone to kill Dennis was an act of self-defense, her last desperate attempt to survive. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Gus Sandstrom, who was himself a friend of Dennis Yaklich, painted a different picture. They claimed Donna killed Dennis for insurance money, that she was a cold, calculating murderer who manipulated two young men into doing her dirty work. Here's where the case becomes truly extraordinary. The jury heard testimony about the cycle of violence, about learned helplessness, about why battered women can't simply leave their abusers, how separation often triggers escalation, how these women face the greatest danger when they try to escape. Expert witnesses explained that Donna fit every criterion of battered woman syndrome, that she genuinely believed she was in imminent danger, that she saw no way out except through Dennis's death. The prosecution's own expert disagreed, arguing Donna did not fit the profile. The jury acquitted Donna of first-degree murder, but they convicted her of conspiracy to commit murder. Here's what's haunting about that verdict. Several jurors later revealed they believed Donna should have been acquitted entirely, but they were afraid of retaliation from the Pueblo Police Department, confused by the legal complexities, under pressure to reach a verdict. They compromised. They voted guilty, placing their faith in the judge to show mercy. The judge sentenced Donna Yaklich to 40 years in prison. The Greenwell brothers, the actual killers, received 20 and 30 years respectively. Donna, who never pulled the trigger, received the longest sentence of all. The jurors were horrified. More than half wrote letters expressing their outrage. They said they'd been misled about the sentencing range. They believed Donna would receive 8 years at most. The judge who reviewed their letters dismissed them as irrelevant. But the questions raised by Donna Yaklich's case wouldn't go away. Even District Attorney Sandstrom made a stunning admission. He said, and I quote, "If she had just done it herself, she would have walked." Think about that for a moment. The very prosecutor who argued Donna killed Dennis for money admitted that if she'd simply shot him herself instead of hiring someone, there would be no issue. What does that tell us about our justice system, about how we view women who fight back against their abusers? In 2005, after serving 18 years, Donna Yaklich was released to a halfway house. She had earned an associate's degree in prison. She was working toward a bachelor's in psychology. She had counseled other victims of abuse. By all accounts, she had been a model prisoner. But the story doesn't end there. Remember Barbara Yaklich, Dennis's first wife, the one who died under suspicious circumstances in 1977? In 2005, a cold case task force reopened the investigation into her death. What they found was damning. The original autopsy concluded Barbara fainted from diet pills, and Dennis accidentally injured her while performing CPR. But a Denver pathologist reviewed the case and called those conclusions very unusual and simply not credible. He determined Barbara's internal injuries were consistent with blunt force trauma, a blow to the abdomen. The investigation was incomplete. No proper crime scene work had been done. Dennis's fellow officers had essentially investigated their own colleague. The task force couldn't prove murder. Too much time had passed. But they changed Barbara Yaklich's cause of death to suspicious and blunt force trauma. Dennis Yaklich may have gotten away with murder once before he became a murder victim himself. So what are we left with? A police detective who terrorized his wife and possibly killed his first wife, protected by his badge and his brothers in blue. A desperate woman who saw murder as her only escape, punished more harshly than the men who actually pulled the trigger. A justice system that acknowledged her abuse but refused to accept her defense. Legal experts still debate the Yaklich case. The Colorado Court of Appeals ruled that self-defense cannot apply in a murder-for-hire situation, even when the defendant suffers from battered woman syndrome. The court wrote, "The killing of another human being is the most extreme recourse to our inherent right of self-preservation and can be justified in law only by the utmost real or apparent necessity brought about by the decedent." But what is imminent danger for a battered woman? Is it only the moment of attack, or is it the constant, credible threat of death that hangs over every day of her life? If a woman believes her abuser will kill her, and has good reason to believe it, how long must she wait? Until he has his hands around her throat? Until it's too late? Donna Yaklich couldn't physically overpower Dennis. She had tried every legitimate avenue for help and been turned away. She had attempted suicide and couldn't go through with it. Was she supposed to simply wait to be killed? These are not easy questions. There are no satisfying answers. Donna Yaklich served her time and was released. She now lives quietly in the Denver metro area, continuing to counsel abuse victims and advocate for battered women. The Greenwell brothers have also been released. Dennis Yaklich is dead, killed in his own driveway almost 40 years ago. Barbara Yaklich is dead, her death still officially suspicious, justice forever beyond reach, and the questions remain. In the years since Donna's trial, our understanding of domestic violence has evolved. We know more about trauma, about coercive control, about why victims stay and why leaving can be the most dangerous moment of all. But has our justice system caught up? When police departments protect their own, even the violent ones, where can victims turn? When battered women's shelters and therapists and even law enforcement partners can't stop the abuse, what options remain? Donna Yaklich made a terrible choice. She crossed a line that society cannot ignore. But society failed her first, and somewhere tonight, another woman is living in fear of the man who swore to love her. Another woman is weighing impossible choices. Another woman is wondering if anyone will believe her, if anyone will help her, if she'll survive long enough to escape. What will we tell her? The story of Donna Yaklich offers no easy answers, only uncomfortable questions that continue to echo through the decades. This has been a special investigative report. Behind every headline is a life that cannot be restored, a warning that went unheeded, and a moment where everything could have changed. If these stories stayed with you, honor the victims by remembering them. Like this video, subscribe for more true crime told with responsibility, and share it so these stories are not forgotten. Good night.